Wholeness and welcome. This is Josh Dippold of integratingpresence.com. Have Randi Green back again with me. Randi, how's it going?
It's going fine, thank you. Good to be here.
Hey, we're going to be talking about this simple question at the first part, simple but not easy. Who are the aliens? And I'm thinking about putting this word aliens in quotes, right? Because I know Randi's work, she's gone back and forth, but not wanting to call them aliens, calling them aliens, extra-systemic races, if I'm remembering sometime. But just we don't want to go into too much background, but Randi's approach on this is probably really unique compared to what all is out there. I mean, some people in other traditions will just call these angels and demons, right? And we've heard in the, spirituals or alternative communities as reptilians and different types of races as well. And then even some cliche things like little green men, and then of course in the Hollywood movies we see these gray beings with the almond eyes. So let's just jump right into this. Who are the aliens? So I guess the terminology is important here too as well.
Yeah. Yes. Well, let's begin with a little bit of background so people can go out and look up other types of information regarding this topic. And there are many different people that work with this over the course of time, from the beginning of the 80s, probably earlier than that, but that's kind of where I got to pick up on some of the information. And we have different prominent people that have been working with this. For instance, if you go to internetarchive.com or .org, I think it's .org.
Yes.
You can find Val Valerian, the information that I think it's...
And then slower, it's Val, the first name, Valerian.
Yeah, Val Valerian. Mm-hmm. And that's the Matrix stuff in its earlier version, long before we had the movie The Matrix, by the way, as far as I think. And I always I've never really known if it was a male or a female, so... Because Val could be a shortening of something else, but...
Val Kilmer, but also Valerie.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So we don't know. Yep.
So this, just to put that in, and that person did a very good... For me, that's foundational for quite a lot of the later material that arose. I'm not saying it is that way, but that's kind of how I perceive it. I see what he or she came with was very close to a lot of the other information that came, whether he or she picked up on the trends that were already back then and put it all together in 5 books, because 5 volumes is a lot of information. And for those of you who are of the newer generation, you will have to test your patience, because it's almost like photocopies, it's PDF, it's old typing, it's old way of setting things up. And it's not the Mandela effect. It's not been put in later on, because I was looking into that material long before we had the changes in our reality. There has been many different authors out there, many different types of books that arose during the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. I can't mention them all, so I won't mention any, so nobody feels left out by not mentioning anyone. We do have, when we talk about the whole cover-up, some of the foundational people there are Richard Dolan as well as Stephen Greer. We have other people that have been working with this for more or less their entire life. We have the old guard of Project Camelot. We have Project Avalon. So there has been many different people that have given their account and their experiences with what we call the extra-terrestrial races or extra-systemic races, and I'll explain why I want to make that distinction.
Ultra-terrestrial, I've heard that term as well.
Yes, but that's not something I work with. These are that's from the later, for instance, the Colontic material, the Voyagers material, where you have that understanding of reality. So I'm not going in that direction either. If people want to go into this whole understanding when we talk about what we call the genetic composition, or we talk about the different races, or we talk about the biology of these different races, not just the psychology, but also the biology. And we talk about them. Are they reptilians? Are they lizards? Are they Dracos? What are they? Where do they come from? What are the systems they come from? And for me, that's where things becomes complicated. The older material were very focused on, oh yeah, these are the Dracos, these are the reptilians, these are the lizards, and they come from this and these systems. And I can say, well, I do know that some of the stars in the Orion system, they are definitely connected to the 8th dimension, that are connected to some of the reptilian lizard races. Others will perceive them as coming from the 7th dimension. And for me, it has been kind of saying, well, it's the same as trying to say, well, Europeans, to tell me about the Europeans. And I would say, well, they got head and arms and legs, right? And they have different type of biology. They have different type of cultural settings. They have a different type of psychology. But when it all comes down to the DNA, it all comes down to the biology, the biological DNA. And for me, that's how I work with the different clusters or groups of races within their understanding of their biology, or what I call the genetics, because that ties into their consciousness potentials, as well as whether or not they are on the arch of progression, or they are on what we call the regression spiral, going out of existence, and by that change their behavior into being service to self instead of being for the unity and the wholeness of all existences.
And just to pause right there, we're only going to be able to do so much, obviously, in this podcast. If you want to know deeper and more comprehensive, Souls of Humanity is Randi's first book. Modern History comes to mind too, yes. But that might be a little further down the road in our talks here. And so to go back to and maybe to I guess, pat my own head with knowledge and stuff. Just a quick overview of the other stuff. You have the Blue Book that was floating around out there, Project Blue Book. I think it was to catalog some of these races and stuff. I think there's a Russian book floating around out there that actually has depictions and visuals. You know, some, I don't know if they're all artist rendering, or some claim to be photography or things like this. And they classify all these different known races or something like that. The UFO community is huge, Jesus. That's a whole other thing. And then we're talking about contact, whether it be with UFOs, whether it be on the inner planes, or whether things materialize. There's also the channeling. People channel, and both Randi and I are not really proponents of channeling things. We're more about direct experiences, being fully conscious while doing this. But now the biology. So this is just where our reference point is, of a human reference point for this, something that's more similar to us, that potentially does have a DNA, or did at one time, right? So, but then there's other I guess, life forms or beings, existences that don't have like a typical DNA, right? It's more of a light body or a plasma body, or how can we go? I guess, how do we look at this between like DNA and things that are beyond DNA, or a different type of genetic classification? These type of things, I think that might be interesting to mention.
Yeah. So for me, when we talk about, I have made the distinction in my material, when we talk about the human biology, we talk about DNA, because that kind of goes with the DNA strands, the frequency fence and the frequency molecular structure humans have inside this type of reality, which is unique in my perspective and how I perceive things. So this is where people, when they begin talking about extra-terrestrial races, that means races that are terrestrial, like our civilization. And I'm just going to here say planetary civilization. Doesn't matter where you live on the planet, we're a planetary civilization. So if we go on the terrestrial angle of perception, and we say we're a terrestrial civilization, and we have this DNA-driven biology that are connected to the atoms and the atomic fields, that goes with electromagnetic features. That's what I mean with frequency, not as in vibration or oscillation, because the other races have vibration and oscillation, but they go into what we call density realities, where the vibration denotes whether their dimensional feature, to put it that way. Also the amount of what we call radiation. And we do have radiation. We have light and particles, light waves and particles inside our reality.
And nuclear radiation, I guess,
yes,
too, right?
Yes, but that's
and heat radiation.
Yes,
but that's
so
different,
also
sure.
these are all wave patterns, more or less, kinetic energy, emission of kinetic processes that goes with the molecular state. So we can divide it into two waves of particles. That's what we understand as frequency or radiation. But when we talk about the extra-systemic races, they come from what we call the constellations or the stars. So that's this. It's a system. It's a stellar system. It's a star system. It's a solar system. So that's why we begin talking about many different levels of reality that are put together in a system. And in a way, you can look at our body as a system and an organic system where we have the different layers that goes from atoms to molecular to our DNA to the cells and whatever's going on in that expansion of the physical form, organized in a specific way into different intestines, into the liver, into the spleen.
Systems, yeah.
Yes, and then going further into the exterior with the muscles and the skin, and that's our surface touch interface system. That's our skin with the outer reality, which then expands further and further out. So that's a terrestrial system. But when I talk about extra-systemic, then we're talking about the entire solar system that we're then part of. That's the further expansion of our perception of reality. And that's where, for me, most of the races I have been in contact with and communicated with, they are from what we call the fourth dimension, and that's part of this systemic level and not the terrestrial, which traditionally is said to be in the third dimension, right? And then time is the fourth. But that's what we call Einsteinian sciences and relativity, and that has very little to do with the way that the extra-systemic races perceive reality, because they work in density realities that goes with oscillation of their vibrational state of what we call higher or lower molecular organic vessels, which in the high vibrational state for us will look as plasma bodies, but on their own level are actually organic bodies like ours. But because we are seeing them or perceiving them from a lower vibrational state, they appear to be light features for us.
And this is the kind of the subtle energies, subtle matter bodies too, that I know from direct experience. These are more accessible. These subtle realms are more accessible when internally I calm down more, focus more for longer periods of time on subtle energies and subtle matter and things like this. Now, I think maybe it might be interesting to note kind of the transition periods between the terrestrial systems and the systemic systems, I guess. Or so I'm thinking maybe, well, quantum. This is a huge buzzword right now, you know. And we talked earlier in an earlier podcast about the astral barrier as well. So maybe these things might come into play in some regards here. Do you feel this is worth mentioning here as far as transition between the two? We hear about higher level beings sometimes presenting themselves in a more physicalized manner, but sometimes not, and for shorter periods, these type of things.
I think the most important thing here is to understand we have an artificial fourth dimension, artificial fifth dimension around our planet, or around our solar system, actually. It's also around our planet, but it's also around our solar system. Because once you go into density energies, we don't have quantum mechanics. We have holographic density, radiation, vibration dynamics, and that's a completely different type of science. So quantum dynamics do not apply to the original worlds or the density worlds. Not at all. Not one single scientific equation, whether it's a matrix or it's from Dirac or it's from Einstein or whoever come up with all of these frequency-based ideas of reality.
Part of the artificial fourth.
Yes, okay. and I can't remember Dirac's first name, but he actually, when he did the matrix science behind the quantum dynamics, amongst many others, Niels Bohr, and also there are many people working on it at the time, he actually tried to implement the fifth dimension, and that was shut down, by the way. Could you imagine where we would have been into the artificial fifth dimension if that had been allowed? From my perspective of things, the colonizing races that were under the Dracos of the D10 collective, that took over our solar system 15,000 years ago. They are a part, along with the maintainer grays, that are upholding that artificial construction in the artificial fourth. That's why I call them maintainer grays. They uphold the artificial fourth. And that's where we have got clone factories, we have got the harvester, we have got the different controllers, we have got all of these. This is a typical way they denote themselves. They don't look upon themselves as gray or the DAOs or whatever we have heard out there. The DAOs are the seven-dimensional grays that are, for me, more associated with the Arcturians. So we have the artificial fourth, where we have maintainers, controllers. They have these group names where they note their name is their function. So that's what they are. They are made for that artificial fourth dimension. And quite a lot of, when we talk about the abduction that took part, again, from my perspective, they were actually coming from what we call similar type of grays, but from other systems outside our solar system. And they don't see themselves as controllers or maintainers or harvesters or collectors or whatever they would come up with different categories. They have a different functionality under, for instance, the way Simon Parkes began talking about these races and the grays were more what we call the extra-systemic that came from parallel realities and entered into ours. And there the grays were what we call the lowest bottom of the hierarchy of these different groups, and they were worker androids, semi-androids, semi-organic, all depending on what level they were on, smaller grays, medium grays, taller grays, and these kinds of things.
Let's just talk about this now. You know, some people that like classifications and putting things in boxes really nice and neat, right? There's a lot of different types of grays, it sounds like. Now, before we talk about those really briefly, I wonder with the maintainer grays that there's, I guess, in kind of Eastern systems, there's devas, right? Yeah. And there's certain classes of devas that would do certain tasks of upholding reality, creating certain things, overlooking things that have been created, maintaining things like this. And I wonder if there's some kind of crossover there or whatever. But
let me answer
and
that one.
And then we'll go into the different classification of grays, right?
Because,
and how to discern them.
Yes, because when we talk about the older spiritual teaching systems, they were part of the hijackers of the old world order. And they came in as different races from different other systems, which are typically called insectoid or avian. That means that at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the parallel systems that begins with insectoid races, of which their top-notch level is the mantids. Then you have the avian races, where they have the top-notch in what we call human avians, which are engineered for the purpose.
Avians,
yes. But human avians, mammal avians, human avians. But this, again, the classification of the different types of features.
And overall, they're humanoid.
Not necessarily. Okay. This is where please don't go into these classifications, because it's important to understand the transition of the different genetics when we talk about these races. Because why is it important? Because it aligns with our own expansion of perception of reality. So if we go into boxing them too much, we are not seeing the variations of these groups. For instance, when we say, oh, this is a reptilian, well, is it a fourth dimensional reptilian, or is it part of the Atlantean reptilians? Is it part of the Enhanced Humans reptilian projects? Are they kind of the hybrid reptilians? Are they part of the lizard lineages, or the part of the dark ones, or which one do they belong to? So that's why it's so important not to go in and say, are they this or that, but constantly see them as a spectrum of energy and consciousness that are in different physical forms, organic forms, that we interpret as a race or as a species, but they themselves do not classify themselves as that. They classify themselves as clusters or collectives or lineages or collaborators or affiliates that they work together with, and they hybridize for their own survival. And that makes the classification of them even more difficult. Because then you have some of the Dracos I've been in contact with. Well, you have the original ones. They are looking down at the later hybrids that were created in the Orion system. And the Orion system, why did they even hybridize the Dracos? They became what we call the scavengers, and they have Pleiadian genetics in them. So that's where the consciousness...
And then we get into if they can time travel in different cycles, right? If they can shape shift and cloak themselves too, then it gets even more so.
Yeah.
And the Draco comes from the Draco constellation originally, right? And, Randy's made these classifications like, which I find are really helpful. Yeah, Draco, reptilian, reptoid, and then lizards.
Yeah.
and then the hybrids amongst those. So
Yeah,
it's
that's
just not
scavengers.
it's not the simple manner of this
Yeah.
is A, B, C, or D kind of
Yes.
thing, right?
So that's where, when in the beginning of the material people were creating that, it was helpful there because we're using our human analogies of have this tendency to classify people as being this or that color, from this or that country, from this or that branch of humanity, and then we kind of think that classification is also, well, most of the time we oversee that these classifications are built upon cultural, psychological dynamics, which of course go into the biology, and it goes into the environment that people have grown out of and learned to survive within. For instance, the Nordic people here up in the north is cold, whereas people that are living in the south, they have a different culture and a different way of being around each other because of the warm weather. That affects their biology, of course, but they still, when we talk psychology to a large degree, we still have the same spectrum of emotions, but the interpretation of this spectrum of emotion comes down to culture. So that's part of where my psychotherapist comes in and say, working with people around the planet, just because we have anger does not mean we all respond to the same way with anger, or just because we have sadness. Cultural differences determine our psychological approach to it. And the same with the different species that are living around us and are part of reality. That's why they have this tendency to focus on different parts of our planet where they want to work. There are certain groups of the Orion system that prefers China. They would never work in the States because they prefer the mentality of the Chinese people.
It reminds me of the base level parallel is supposedly my ancestors 6 generations ago or something like that, give or take 3 or 4, came from Germany for the most part. And when they were coming up the Mississippi River from the ocean, from Germany in the boat, they saw southeast Missouri as looking very similar to where they lived. And I hear the same thing with there's a larger Nordic population up further north in Wisconsin, I guess in Minnesota. So anyway, okay. So now,
I want to return to the
please.
Davis,
Yes,
because I had to take that
that's
detour.
Right. Yes,
because then when we talk about the insectoid and the avian races of the old world order hijackers, they came here in their original vessels and they put many of these in stasis. Then they recreated, when they came 15,000 years ago, we still have what we call slight remains of the original fourth dimension that belongs to our solar system. And then they created the artificial fourth dimension. And then they created new vessels that were able to be in between the original fourth dimension and the artificial fourth dimension. But eventually these vessels broke down, and then many of them just resumed what we could call a type of vessel inside the artificial fourth, but they were operational inside this reality. But as the original fourth dimension broke down, it became part of what we call the distortion field, which is the basic information of the astral plane. And that's why many of these quote-unquote divas, they can appear as light beings on the astral plane because they have the configuration of the original fourth, but are now artificial beings per se. They're holographically re-engineered to be existing in the artificial fourth, often in actual an insectoid body, but they can use the old holographic overlay or the astral projection mechanism to appear for humans as in their original otherworldly form. These are the devas.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, and see, I haven't heard that take on this anywhere else. That's what makes this really unique. And I would invite people with some of these abilities to go check this out for themselves, envision and experience. And then let's talk about a little bit of experience. So this all comes, a lot of this doesn't, I know you have a background with the Bailey material, Alice A. Bailey material, but you've done a long series too on that, on how, what part of it's credible and, at the times they were only allowed to say certain things. And then what part of it completely doesn't jibe with your experience about what you know in the inner realms and your encounters as well.
Because I began with the Bailey material, and then as I grew into a larger sensitivity and my clairvoyant abilities, I've always been a child of nature. And I've past lives working with different nature beings, so it was quick to get that back in play. As a Native American medicine woman, I was already working with herbs and nature spirits, and that came quickly back into play again inside this physical form, as part of this physical form. So once I began activating my original energy system, that capacity came back in. I began talking to the nature spirits were now walking from the perspective of the Beta material. And there I quickly came into all sorts of astral thought forms and ideas that others had created, and it didn't match what I was perceiving. And these entities, even though that they, out of courtesy, presented themselves as trolls or fairies or elves, and I still use that classification just because it's so much simpler, similar to when we talk about the practice of the ideas of the Buddha. People say this is Buddhism, but anyone that are doing this kind of say, yeah, it's a little bit more complicated about that, but we can go with that classification because for the sake of easiness. Mm-hmm. So, but what these different beings began to show me was that what they originally were when they came here a very long time ago, and how they actually used to be races from other systems that, due to, as I talked about, the dynamic between the original fourth that then ceased to exist, it ceased to exist some 12,000 years ago and completely were taken away from our reality, which also explains when we talk some of these old monolithic structures, they used to be what we call in a flexible type of crystalline state of organic matter that then crystallized because of the removal of the original fourth dimension, became stones. As we know of them, these huge granite stones and blocks, they were flexible and changeable using alien technology and not mind over matter, not levitation, not the big sound waves, not all of these ideas people have come up with. It was as simple as it was part of the original fourth dimension where everything's holographic. You create a cube, you create a specific type of technology, you arrange the holographic feature, you impose it onto the energy you're working with, and it takes form after it. It's easy peasy. But once the artificial fourth dimension came in, running all sorts of control mechanisms and deliberately downsizing our reality to not have that feature as a mean of control and as a mean to downsize our organic vessels into this solidified state. Many of the beings that actually came here as part of the original projects or decided to come here because the Dracos promised them manners and the land of honey and milk, right? So not conflating it, but just using that for fun a little bit. But they were promised a lot of stuff. And as they came here and gave away their original bodies, put them in stasis, they were actually captured and taken. And then they fled from that holographic form they were given. And then they became these nature spirits hiding in nature, using the original Pleiadian construction of transformative processes which nature were engineered to be, and began being there as part of that to continue their existence, hiding from the suppressors, hiding from the ones that got them here, and by that became what we perceive as nature spirits.
Some of them known as the hidden people too,
yes.
Right? And it's wild to think that some of these experiences we're having, if there's a more original body back in stasis somewhere that's been forgotten about. Okay, so we're talking about experiencing here. Now, these are things that happen with your eyes open, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No,
so,
I'm walking out in nature.
Yes,
I'm having a very broad conversation
with yes, exactly.
Going on.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's, and the reason why they come to me, aside from already having the ability to communicate, is my work as I call a releaser, because our world is changing. What we call density 2 of the original vibrational holographic radiation state of our reality is changing because the sun is changing. We're turning into what's called a density 1. And these different races that used to be part of what we call the original middle domain that went with density 2 or dimension 4, 5, and 6 of the original solar system densification, if we call it that, they want to return through the gate systems, because once a system changed to the degree it does now, there are specific gates that opens that allows for what we call evacuation. And that's part of what I'm doing with these that have been hidden for so long. They come to me and present themselves, am I a troll or am I an elf or whatever? And I work with them. And often some of the elves are actually all Pleiadian races, but of an insectoid variety that were originally human mammal level, but has due to regression become insectoid in their genetics. So they might have wings, they might appear as a little bit of fairy beings, but when we talk about the extra-systemic type of classification, then they have become insectoids, and that's the level I can then work with them, get rid of that one, and release their original consciousness potentials from where they let go of the energetic counter that is part of their genetics of the density variation or variability rate, as it's called, and then release them through the gate systems as pure consciousness units.
It brought to mind Randy's course about the stargates. There's also gates and bridges, and goes into more detail, not necessarily specifically about this, but in general, overall, these type of ways and means and portals for transport and transitioning and transport. Also, this whole understanding of this classification, it brings new light, adds an extra way to see all the diversity of life forms on this planet. Yeah. So many different insectoid species, all the bird life too, and mammals and reptiles as well. There's a lot, if anybody that's turned on the National Geographic Channel or some kind of nature show can see, or just walk outside their door and pay attention to animals. Yeah. So.
But these beings are actually not part of what we call the original benevolent races. So they are part of the colonizing races, and most of these beings, not that I'm saying that all animals and all insects and all birds are evil beings.
Well, they are.
But they are what we call an anchor for some of the artificial fourth dimensional races.
And this goes in line with some of the older things, like in Buddhism and I guess maybe Hinduism, where it is a lower birth as to animals. And these are the two realms that are only able to, most people can only see the animal realm, right, and the human realm. Yeah. But there's all these other realms that only certain people with certain abilities have, easier access to seeing and knowing, right?
So what we're talking about here is the normal perception of reality, what you can see, the tangible one, what we are being indoctrinated to. This is what we are able to perceive, as well as limited by the sciences, the prohibiting sciences behind the very limited spectrum of frequency, not fence, but it is controlled by the frequency fence. What we can see with our eyesight, the cells in our eyes can only perceive within a specific range of light. And process light features within that specific limited band of energy, and there's an enormous amount of frequencies we're not seeing with our physical eyes.
Yeah, and we can just look at cats and things like this too, and dogs. There's and the limitations we impose on ourselves too. I think that's a huge one. The self-imposed limitations we give ourselves too, whether we want to fit in life or we, or so many different reasons.
But that goes into, again, this is important when we talk about who are the aliens.
Yes.
Because when we talk about the perception of the different realities, if we perceive it within our limitations, we will only see so little. So we need to expand our awareness to go into our mind's eye or have the extraordinary sensing capacities awakened. That goes with density energies. And these are something we need to build into our physical form, using the emotional field to go into the subconscious, to go into past lives, to go into the astral plane, and by that bring into the artificial fourth, which we unfortunately have to clear our way through. And when we talk about the mind, then we have to go into the artificial fifth and work our way beyond that to get to the real fourth dimension and the real fifth dimension of the middle domains of our solar system. And that's why we will find more what we call the benevolent races. So we can see the prohibiting technologies, the colonizers were all about prohibiting and preventing us from accessing the original density energies of our system, and by that have the control of us, and by that be able to control what we perceive, what we engage in, the teaching systems, the spirituality systems, or whatever type of system we're talking about. It's all about controlling our biofield, our emotional field, our mental field.
Domination and control.
Yes, to stick within the artificial realities under the colonizers of the artificial fourth and the artificial fifth. So that's the freedom journey that we are on.
Yes, and at the same time, not to fall into victimhood over this either, right? Because if we really want to work towards these things, we can. I know Randy's courses in the progression work, she goes into her own unique way of doing energy work too. So people can check that out as well. And the past lives, right? So a lot of these experiences came from past lives, recalling past lives, remembering who we are, who and what we are, or even if we don't have that ability yet, we can be inspired by other people's as well, right?
But one of the things that comes in when we talk about where do I have this information from? Well, because I work as a releaser, then it's like being an expanded version of a psychotherapist and a healer, which I used to work with as well. I began as a healer psychotherapist, working as a clairvoyant with people and what they had. And as I worked my way deeper into the energy system, that's where I began seeing these different layers and unraveling them. And then suddenly the artificial fourth insectoid avian races came in, or the falling angelics, or what have you, and then encountering all of these different levels via the client's energy system.
Yeah. And this is another important thing, because people, how do I get there? How do I get there? Well, we talked about, the energy work, what Randy's working with clients. I mean, people doing, I call it service work, but I mean, it's any kind of work in the field like this, healing work. And Randy came up with a unique thing called a template reading. And you were doing those for a while until they got a little bit off the rails as well. But it's a really unique thing I hadn't heard of before. And you can find out how to do a template reading on yourself too. And this is where you got all this different type of information that really people haven't got into so much. Really detailed, kind of more scientific classification of this, right?
And that's where I came across the understanding of, instead of trying to classify people as, are you Pleiadian, or are you Sirian, or are you this, when we talked about the whole stellar activation cycle, everybody was a Sirian, or everybody was a Pleiadian, right? Or I'm an Orion, or I am this, or I am that. Again, this whole I am this, I am that, which again is when we talk about the past lives, we talk about the multiple timelines we have had an organic vessel connected to, or functional on, or depending on which level of our energy system we have been working on that different timelines. We don't always have to have an organic form. We can just connect via our mind field to a code stream and then experience that reality holographically, which suffices to alter our, what we call neural network in our organic vessels of the higher density variation. And we can, via our, what do you call variety? What do you call that word?
Variety?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
That word just kept slipping my mind, but that's the one I was looking for.
Sure.
So we don't necessarily have to have organic vessels. That's typically a thing we do in the outer domain, and that's the original classification of a terrestrial system. It's the outer domain where we take on very dense type of organic vessels so we can clear timelines vibrationally and radiationally via holographic means. So that means the inner work, that means the clearing work, which we can do as well today. And that's one of the probabilities and possibilities that comes back with going into the density 1 feature, because that's the original density 1 feature of our systemic terrestrial system or outer domain system that bridges between the outer domain and the middle domain. And the middle domain density 2 is the systemic level that goes with dimension 4, 5, and 6. The outer domain is not dimension 1, 2, or 3, but it has become that. So this is where we work now, but it will change.
We have a unique opportunity, during this time, take advantage of it as well.
Yes.
Right. So the other thing was, you mentioned, well, as far as experiencing and things, you do get pulled into council meetings too. Maybe talk a little bit about that as well. And of course, there's the classic people are different beings or entities trying to take, let's just say, field violation, trying to get force themselves into us against our consent and will. Some people might call it a possession, things like this, where, that's not a common everyday occurrence, but it's a real visceral experience of things like that happening, right? So these two things, the council meetings, the holographic council meetings, I think,
Yes,
most
of that is part of some kind of artificial drum up from some of the artificial fourth and fifth dimensional races that are using that as a kind of derailing mechanism. So I would prefer not to go into that, because many people say, oh, I've been to the councils and I'm listening to this and that. And I'm always, because first and foremost, when I went to Australia, I think that's where I really got the severe kick in the butt when we talk about the extra-systemic and the extraterrestrial races that are present here and some of the experimentations that's going on. Because when I went to Australia, because I come from a Nordic country, and that's the old, what we call the old civilizations. Europe has, or your Eurasian template, we're here talking planetary templates, has some of the oldest civilizations on it. So when we travel to the new worlds as Australia or America, those of us who come from these countries and are activated and have affiliation with the old civilizations will be perceived as someone that deserves a kind of respect and an involvement in what is going on, either to accredit it and say thumbs up, oh, this is so good, or thumbs down, this is not so good. And for me, it was this kind of this old being is here, and they wanted to show off the lesser ones. And as they showed me more and more, the higher levels of the hierarchy was, hey, something's going on here that's out of our control. And then they came in because we have all of the lower levels in the artificial fourth of the different groups that are here, and they are running their everyday life as we are running our everyday life. The higher levels and the higher dimensions, they only come in from time to time. That's typically where we have, for instance, here in Denmark, 2 days ago, we had a huge chemtrailing that created literally crosses in the sky, creating different nodal points. And for me, that's where they were creating the mantis showed me how they can triangulate between 3 spots in the sky and create a bridge from that one, which they can enter into. And no, it's not an Einstein-Rosen bridge. It's not a tunnel. It's not a wormhole.
And it's not flying saucers.
Yes, no, they're using the artificial fourth dimension to bleed into our reality, from where they can access the levels that are so close, but on the other side of the frequency fence, so people cannot perceive it via the normal physical means unless they are targeted to be able to see it. Then they create a temporary clearance in the neural network and in the eyesight that allows people to see crafts and allow people to perceive and understand what's going on. Unless we are having groups from outside of our parallel system that comes in as orbs or as plasma ships. These are typically 7th dimensional, and they come in their 7th dimensional feature because that can override some of the artificial 4th dimensional security mechanisms there are. So all of this is some of the things they taught me when I was in Australia. And that's a completely different perception of reality.
And think about the kind of base level or base program analog maybe would be spy operations, There are so many different classified things going on. Well, maybe not, right? If they're classified, we can't know about them because they're classified. But if we're led to believe of all the past things that have been declassified, there's all kinds of operations going on right under our noses all the time. Not to get freaked out about it, but these are the professionals doing their professional work or whatever. Maybe, I don't know, because it's classified, right? But yeah, that's what came to mind there. Now, I guess if you want to hear more about the Randi's experiences or information from council meetings, there's an update you can do on the 2023 updates, as well as some of the other course materials. I know you deal with that as far as these other types of experiences, the clone worlds, I don't know if we can call them that, the storyboards, and I'll just leave that as a terminology. You guys can learn more about that.
That's part of the clearing work of the artificial fourth. Where I would like to go here, because let me give just a rough overview of my course material. There is the psychological change that needs to be done when you begin working with these different levels of reality, whatever type of system that people prefer to work within. And because of my background as both as a psychotherapist, but also a healer, clairvoyant, as well as also being, I had my feet rooted deeply into the business world, as well as a bachelor degree in theology, not because I'm religious, but literally learning how to read the old Bible in its original languages and these kind of things. So just as a curiosity, as in how does science actually work with these ancient texts? I could have chosen to study Egyptology. Thank you. But my mind doesn't want to go there, so that's why it's cramming right now. Where I want to go is this, just to put it in here, the clearing work of the artificial fourth is in the advanced clearing work courses I have made. So it's built up in a step-ladder manner where I take people by the hand in the free material, get out of the old thought systems, and then in the progression sciences, lead them into a more advanced way of working with this, if it's for people, if it resonates with people. But when we talk about the extraterrestrial race, because that's what's at stake here, what we have touched ground with in here is already kind of, there are extraterrestrial races that have become part of our planet, but they technically still are extraterrestrials. That's what we find in nature and on the distortion fields and as part of the astral plane. And they are just as enslaved as we are. And I want to put that word in here, enslaved, because I've already said 15,000 years ago, our solar system was colonized and humanity is enslaved. And there is absolutely no doubt about that. So our path of liberation, to use the Buddhist teaching words there.
And Hinduism too, they talk
Yes.
about being liberated.
When we talk Hinduism, that's why we come into the whole Deva kind of thing. And that classification, they become the gods then that rules us and controls us. But that's just an ancient way of saying enslavement. You
Yes,
have to
absolutely.
appease the gods to be able to exist.
And I like the word too, because the past we can see that happen in our not too distant past in everyday life, but also gives an immediacy to this. Not just, oh, this is another Netflix show or whatever, right? This is the one thing I wanted to touch on back into briefly before we wrap this up is this notion of kind of technology, especially in today's society. You talked about the prohibiting technologies, and here we get cell phones, right? Smartphones. That's what we get, right? But the distinction Randi makes is this technology based on natural, quote unquote, natural human consciousness and energy that there's a complete control over, that it's made as a supplement and that's made to dissolve after it's being used, or the opposite, where some of these races, they rely solely on technology. It's not necessarily does anything to progress their own consciousness or even came out of their own consciousness. Maybe they came across it somehow, and now that's kind of their gods, that they run everything on this technology, right? So I guess is that classification fair to say with some of these races and not? And how should we go about approaching this? Because I know we're in it's in March 2023 here for the timestamp, and early March, and a new thing came out with these chat bots and thing. It's kind of popular now, but that's a really low level parallel to what I mentioned here. Yep.
Yeah. What I can say is that in this podcast, we have mainly talked about the fourth dimensionals. When we talk about AI and we talk about that, then we're talking about the groups of the third cycle that bridges into the artificial fifth. And that's a whole other classification. So what I want to take away from this podcast is that when we talk about the extra-systemic or the extraterrestrial races, we need to know what level they operate on. And the only way we can really do that is if we know ourselves completely and expand our own awareness to be able to communicate and deal with all of these other levels of reality, and not get too hyped up of focusing on the tangible thing, as in AI and bots and what have you, which is of course important, but that's the fifth dimensional level. So only people that are beginning to activate their biofield and their mental field will be able to perceive these realities, whereas the majority of humans are able to go through their emotional field and their heart field into the astral plane and go into the release work of these different extra-systemic races that are stuck here as part of nature or part of their own body. And that's also where the Bala material comes in and talk about in the teachers of white magic, that we are to do as humans as part of this system, as this outer domain is not only working in our own expansion to upgrade, she works with the chakras, the chakra system, but also to release the prisoners of this planet. And we are just as much these prisoners of this planet. And for me, the whole focusing on just that level or that group or whatever, that's where the human mind comes in and narrow things down, put it in too many boxes where it doesn't belong, and instead begin to work with things as a spectrum. On which level of the spectrum am I working now? Know that understanding. Am I working on the emotional field, the biofield, the mental field? Which system of thought am I working within that gives me the answers to the questions I ask? If I am working within, and I'm here saying if I, not me, but anyone who is working within the belief system Christianity will then come up with that these are demons or angels. If you work within the concept of being a UFO researcher, you will come up with a classification that goes along with crafts or goes along with some of the classifications that were done in the 80s and the 90s. The question are these classifications incorrect? Are they suitable? Are there any of these groups left? So when we come to the higher level understanding, and not that I want to toot my own horn here saying, oh, I'm so fucking advanced, but that's just the way I have perceived things, that instead of going to the box making classification and putting labels, which humans are so good at, and we are being taught in our human society right now to deconstruct the labels on all levels, males and females. Everything is in the deconstruction right now. So we're in that deconstruction phase of our psychological and societal constructions. And that goes when we talk about the encounter and the experience with other terrestrial races or extra-systemic races or extra-terrestrial races from other systems, parallel realities, that we look upon them as in an experience every time. What are we dealing with here? Not just letting us get stoked by or completely blinded by, oh, this is a reptilian, but actually go deeper as we're doing in our own inner work. Go layer by layer by layer until you're going through the overlay, because many of these races are using holographic overlays.
Yes.
And what you will end up with will be an insectoid or an old crumbling DNA of the avian kind of the old brotherhoods. That's completely decomposing and smell ugly, by the way. Or you will come up with a little critter, or it's just an energetic parasite, or it might actually be something completely different.
Or you might connect to the cubes, right?
Yes, in the fifth dimension.
Well, we have so much deception in our everyday lives, so it really doesn't surprise me. Now, everything we've been talking about now is still within kind of these after timeline event thing.
Yes.
So you once called it the holographic metaverse after going beyond all this, right? So is there anything to say about who are the quote unquote aliens there once we get out of all this back into the true human worlds and these type of things, right? Any way to describe them? Oh, one other loose end too, and probably won't go too much into it now, but these beings that have come back from the future, right? They could have been us or someone very much like us, who knows how far in advance, and come back. So that's another that some people are maybe mislabeling or saying quote unquote aliens, right? So
I would say here in this podcast, because I'm even though I say I'm not doing classification, then when we talk about explaining things, it needs to be within groups. Here we have touched ground with the artificial fourths, with the devas, we have classified that group. So when you ask of the original progressive races, you're then pushing my mind somewhere else, which in itself is a full podcast. So here I will say that if people are curious about the original progressive races that I originate from, then the whole philosophy book is a good take, where I talk about how we used to do things as part of the Pillar Project. The New Grand Cycle Transition Course 1 and 2 is the basic level of that understanding, and I work further into it in the 7-course material of the Transition Sciences, where I talk about what we originally engineered here and why we did what we did here, what the original restoration program is, the transformative energy system, and then learn the practicality of it instead of a classification of who are the benevolents. Because what is a benevolent race? The dark guys or the insectoids or the regress races, they see the progressive humans as the bad guys, and we do the other way around. And these are part of the segregation dynamics. So again, when we talk about classification, is useful for a period of time so we understand what we're dealing with. But investigation and complete going layer by layer by layer is just as much part of the understanding of who we are, who they are, and what's going on here, because we're working with energy and consciousness. And we will perceive everything we're dealing with on the different levels of our consciousness potentials. So unless we expand our perception of reality, we will only see figments and little pieces of the full picture that we're dealing with. It's like a kaleidoscope. It changes according to what tool we're using to look through the looking glass, so to speak. If we are using that system of thought, we will only see pieces of it. If we're using our eyes or physical senses, we are only seeing that piece of it. If we go into our inner senses, we're only using the emotional field, we'll only see that level of it. If we go into the astral plane, we will see that level of it. Go into the artificial fourth, I think people are getting the picture.
Holographic, yes. Okay.
Yes, so it's all about, that's the expansion, that's the path of liberation, is to understand all of these levels without, again, as we talk about within the path of liberation, its original form of the Theravada ideas, is not to cling on to things, not to cling on to concepts or constructs or ideas or a perception of reality, perception of self, perception of others, but always working with it as a spectrum, as something that is changeable, and it should change, because as we change, then we change our perception of reality and we change our energy system. And by changing that, we will see new things. And if we cling on to what was before, we're taking away the opportunity of learning and experiencing new levels of who and what we actually are in our own journey of remembering who we actually are. So if people ask, Randi, what would you say is the key point of knowing the extraterrestrial races or knowing who else is out there? That's the same as if when we are inside this reality, learning what are other people, how do other people operate, so we can meet up either in inclusivity, where we are accepting and work from a level of compassion, understanding, and loving kindness, or the opposite if need be, because a predator is a predator. And we need to approach a predator on the level of the predator, which the predator deserves. And that's principle 2, the law of balance.
Or not approach them.
Well, it depends on who and what we are, because there are diplomats, there are some that are teachers, there are some that are scientists, and then there are others like me that took the task to be what we would call a warrior, that were part of some of these systems that after the timeline event and where things began to fall apart, to defend the systems, not to instigate wars, but to defend and to guard it.
Yep. The Second Amendment in the United States, right? So that's part of the original intent of that.
Yes.
The non-aggression principle. I still have not met anyone that's against that. Basically, meaning no one has the right to aggress on another. But once one is aggressed upon, of course, they have the right to defend themselves and their loved ones. So this is going to do it for now. For the next one, perhaps, why are the aliens here and what do they want, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This will do it for the end of this podcast. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Thank you.